It is just past midnight on Guadalcanal, October 1942, and the sky over Henderson Field is on fire. Japanese naval guns are walking shells across the runway in long, deliberate lines. 15-inch rounds from battleships offshore are tearing craters the size of houses into the coral and dirt. Overhead, a lone Japanese aircraft circles patiently, dropping a bomb every few minutes just to keep the exhausted Marines and pilots below from sleeping. They call him Washing Machine Charlie because of the uneven drone of his engine, and by now the sound alone is enough to make grown men flinch. The Japanese commanders watching this bombardment from offshore believe something simple and, on paper, entirely reasonable. An airfield this badly cratered cannot function. No planes can take off from a runway full of holes. Without air cover, the American position on Guadalcanal collapses, and Japanese troop convoys can land unopposed. But every morning, as the sun comes up over Henderson Field, American fighters and dive bombers are lifting off the exact runway that was supposedly destroyed 12 hours earlier. The Japanese believe they are winning a war of destruction. What they don't understand yet is that the Americans have quietly built a war of restoration, and it is about to decide who controls the South Pacific. By late 1942, Japan had built an empire on speed and audacity. Their carrier strikes had crippled the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. Their army had taken the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies faster than most Western planners thought possible. Japanese naval gunnery, honed for night engagements, was among the most feared in the world, and their pilots in 1942 were still, plane for plane, some of the most experienced anywhere. Their doctrine around Guadalcanal followed a pattern that had worked everywhere else: isolate the enemy position, cut off its supply and air support, then finish it with troops landed by sea. Henderson Field, originally a Japanese construction project seized by US Marines in August 1942, was, in Japanese planning, simply an obstacle to neutralize. Bomb it by day, shell it by night, ground the American planes, and the Marines holding the island would be starved of the air cover keeping Japanese troop transports at bay. It was not an unreasonable plan. It had worked, in different forms, across the Pacific for the better part of a year. Runways were fragile things. Craters didn't fill themselves. And Japan's naval gunfire, especially during bombardments like the one in mid-October, was landing hundreds of large-caliber shells directly onto and around the airstrip in a single night. The Japanese had every reason to believe Henderson Field could not survive this kind of punishment for long. What they had not accounted for was who was waiting on the other end of every crater. The men keeping Henderson Field alive were not glamorous. They were Navy construction battalions, Seabees, along with Marine engineers, men recruited specifically because they had been bulldozer operators, carpenters, and heavy equipment mechanics in civilian life before the war. Their motto, still new at the time, was blunt: construimus, batuimus. We build, we fight. What the Japanese were bombing wasn't just a runway, it was a system. American engineers had begun laying interlocking perforated steel planking, mast and mat, designed to be assembled quickly, absorb damage, and be repaired in sections rather than rebuilt from scratch. Crews were organized into standing repair teams with equipment pre-positioned near the strip, not stored somewhere safe in the rear. Graders, dump trucks, and coral fill were kept close enough to the runway that repair could begin within minutes of a bombardment ending. not ours. This was the part Japanese planners never fully grasped. They were fighting the airfield as if it were a fixed target that could be worn down like a fortress wall. The Americans had turned it into something closer to a living wound that healed overnight, not because of some miracle piece of equipment, but because of drilled, repeatable process under fire. That distinction, a target versus a system, is what the next several nights on Guadalcanal would expose in brutal detail. The night of the bombardment, as Marines and sailors on the island would simply call it, began like the others, only heavier. Japanese battleships Kongo and Haruna moved offshore under cover of darkness and opened fire with their main batteries, something American forces had not faced in this campaign before. These were not the smaller harassment shells of Washing Machine Charlie. These were battleship guns, designed to punch through armored hulls, now aimed at a dirt and steel runway. For over an hour, shells rained onto Henderson Field and the surrounding area. Fuel dumps burned. Aircraft on the ground were destroyed where they sat. The air smelled like burning aviation gas and churned coral dust. Marines and pilots crouched in slit trenches, feeling the ground itself lift with each impact, uncertain whether there would be a runway left to fly from once the sun came up. This was the moment Japanese commanders believed they had finally delivered the knockout blow. A battleship bombardment of that scale, against an unarmored airstrip, was expected to end flight operations for days, maybe longer. The Seabees and engineers did not wait for daylight to find out. As soon as the shelling paused, work crews were moving onto the runway in the dark, checking crater by crater with flashlights shielded against enemy spotters, marking which sections were flyable and which needed fill. It was slow, dangerous, deliberate work, done with the knowledge that the bombardment could resume at any moment. But this was exactly the kind of work the pre-positioned equipment and drilled procedures had been built for. By early morning, enough of the runway had been patched with coral fill and matting that American aircraft were taking off again, battered, reduced in number, but flying. Japanese reconnaissance had expected silence. Instead, dive bombers and fighters were once again climbing off Henderson Field to intercept Japanese aircraft and strike at Japanese ships approaching the island. That should have ended the argument right there. It didn't. Because the Japanese, watching American planes still operating the next day, drew the wrong lesson from it. Rather than concluding that the airfield itself had become resistant to destruction, many in the Japanese command structure assumed the bombardment simply hadn't been heavy enough, or that American aircraft numbers were being propped up by reinforcements from elsewhere. The solution, in their thinking, was more bombardment, not a rethink of the whole approach. So the shelling and bombing continued, night after night, through October and into November. Each time the pattern repeated: destruction after dark, restoration before dawn. Aircraft losses on the ground mounted. Fuel had to be hand-carried in some stretches because storage was repeatedly hit. Pilots flew exhausted in patched-together planes, off a runway that had been cratered again just hours earlier. And still, every morning, Henderson Field put aircraft into the air. This was where the deeper American advantage revealed itself. Not in a single dramatic repair, but in the accumulation of nights where the Japanese timetable simply refused to hold. Japanese convoys bringing troop reinforcements to Guadalcanal, the Tokyo Express, depended on American air power being suppressed long enough for transports to land safely in daylight or slip through at night unmolested. Every morning, Henderson Field's planes were airborne was another morning that plan failed to fully materialize. The men of the Cactus Air Force, a mixed force of Marine, Navy and Army pilots flying off Henderson, did not fly because the runway was undamaged. They flew because a system existed behind them that assumed damage was inevitable and built repair directly into daily operations. That is the part the Japanese never solved. They were fighting a fixed target. The Americans had built an airfield designed to be temporarily broken and routinely fixed, faster than the enemy could re-break it. By November 1942, the pattern had become unsustainable. For Japan, not for the Americans. The naval battles fought to protect and resupply Guadalcanal, including the costly nighttime clashes around the island, drained irreplaceable Japanese ships, veteran pilots, and experienced crews that Japan's industrial base could not quickly replace. Every night Henderson Field kept flying was a night American strike aircraft could hit Japanese transports and warships trying to reinforce the island. The airfield that Japanese planners had expected to silence within days had instead become the fulcrum that wore down Japan's ability to contest the Southern Solomons at all. Guadalcanal, and the runway at its center, shifted from a contested foothold to the place where Japanese offensive momentum in the Pacific broke. By February 1943, Japanese forces evacuated Guadalcanal entirely. The airfield that battleship guns, bombers and nightly harassment raids had failed to permanently silence remained in American hands for the rest of the war, eventually growing into a major forward base supporting operations further up the Solomon chain. The exact tonnage of ordnance dropped and fired at Henderson Field across the campaign was immense, delivered across dozens of separate bombing and naval bombardment actions. What mattered more than the tonnage was the outcome. Despite sustained, heavy, repeated attack from sea and air, American aircraft operated from that runway on the vast majority of mornings during the campaign. That fact, more than any single raid, is what defeated Japanese planning. What Guadalcanal exposed was a mismatch in how each side understood warfare against fixed infrastructure. Japan's approach to neutralizing an airfield assumed that destruction, applied with enough force, would eventually be permanent. It was an assumption drawn from years of success against enemies who lacked the equipment, manpower, or doctrine to rebuild quickly under fire. The Americans had quietly solved a different problem. Naval construction battalions, formed only months earlier in early 1942, specifically because the Navy recognized it would need men who could build and fight simultaneously under combat conditions, brought organized labor, standardized materials like interlocking steel matting, and pre-staged equipment directly into the most contested real estate in the Pacific. It wasn't a secret weapon. It was a logistics and engineering doctrine that treated damage as a scheduling problem rather than a catastrophe. This lesson did not stay confined to Guadalcanal. Seabee construction battalions went on to build and repair airfields across the Pacific for the rest of the war, from the Solomons to the Marianas to Iwo Jima, often working within range of enemy fire and frequently completing runways in a fraction of the time pre-war military engineers had considered possible. The habits formed defending Henderson Field under battleship gunfire became the template. Japan built an empire on speed. At Henderson Field, it ran headfirst into an American system built to repair faster than Japan could destroy, and lost the initiative in the Pacific because of it. The story of Henderson Field is not a story about one hero, one raid, or one lucky night. It's a story about a runway that should have died a dozen times and didn't, because the men who kept it alive had turned repair itself into a weapon. Japan understood how to break things. What it never fully understood, until it was too late to matter, was that the United States had built men and methods that could put those things back together faster than the enemy could tear them apart. On Guadalcanal, that difference didn't just save an airfield. It cost Japan the initiative in the Pacific War.